So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dave Joe. He is a seminal person within the Champanejac First Nation, of course, the Yukon. He has spent his entire career fighting for the rights of our people. Many of you know him. Certainly, if you want to know where all of the hangouts to go to in Ottawa, Mr. Joe has them. So I welcome him to come on up and do the presentation.
Thank you very much, Chief, for those kind words, and totally true. I am the captain of sin, and I have been coming to this town for over 50 years, and I was part of the delegation that traveled from the Yukon 50 years ago, and Valentine's Day 1973 to present to then Prime Minister Trudeau our sort of petition to launch the land claim agreement process in the Yukon. So I'll tell you my story, right? Because I want to save a lot of time for my friend and colleague John Bizot, who equally has many interesting stories to tell, I'm sure. But my First Nation name is Dagé. I'm a member of, Steve was my chief, still is my chief. That's our tradition. Once a chief, always a chief, like once a sinner, always a sinner. So I was born in the Yukon in the period in which, interesting period in Canada's history, not probably the most romantic period of time, but I was born in 1949 in a little village called Cluckshoe, Yukon. Got a lot of salmon there. We're a salmon people. And I grew up there. And in 1949, for those of you that remember that year, when you were born, like if you're born an Indian, you weren't allowed to vote. Can you imagine that? Like you're like disenfranchised totally. You weren't allowed to own land. Certainly could serve in the army, join the armed forces, as Steve's father did, Elijah Smith. And you were denied a number of basic human civil rights. Just, it was a no-go. That was the Indian Act that existed in 1927 to 1951. So when I was 2 years of age, a lot of those statutory restrictions, there's a lot of lawyers in this room, right? We weren't allowed to retain legal counsel for the purpose of advancing a land claim. That was against the law when I was born. That law was removed, of course, in 1951. So during that period, and during that period of time, Indian children, all Indian children between the ages of 7 and 16, many of you in this room experienced this, had to attend school. And of course, there were no schools in Cluckshoe, where I came from. So we were sent to residential school, right? So I did my time from 1956 to 1967. I got kicked out because, you know, once a sinner, always a sinner, I guess. But during that period of time, from 1950, in the 1950s, it was an interesting period. They did remove the statutory sort of restrictions about what Indians could do and could not do. And during that period of time, of course, I did attend residential school at two places. One called the Whitehorse Indian Baptist Mission School. Do we have any Baptists in the room? None of you. You're all sinners then. So I attended there, then I went to Yukon Hall. And in the 60s, we exited the 50s in which they removed some of the statutory bars that were in place for us Indians. And in the 60s, we began to come into ourselves, right? And in 1969, Pierre Trudeau, bless his soul, he came up to the Yukon in June of 1969. And Steve's older brother, his name was Mike Smith, he and I were sent by, not asked, sent by Steve's father, Elijah Smith, who was then our president. And he said, "You boys," he had this deep voice, "you boys, you got to go down and ask Prime Minister Trudeau when he's going to recognize Aboriginal title." So me and Mike said, "Yeah, we could do that." So we went down to the gymnasium, right? He was talking at a place called the Whitehorse Elementary School. So he took questions at the end, right? So me and Mike put up our hands, same question we were going to ask. And whoever was the moderator pointed to Mike. And Mike had this great, clear voice, said, "Prime Minister Trudeau, when are you going to recognize Aboriginal title?" And Trudeau says, "What is Aboriginal title? It's a nebulous concept." So I turned to Mike and I said, "What the flip is nebulous?" And he said, "Vague, unsure." So 4 years later, 1973, when we met Trudeau again, this is after the Nishka court case came out, and thank you very much for that great win in the Supreme Court of Canada. Supreme Court of Canada on January 31st, for those of you who are historians and legal advisors, know on January 31st, 1973, Supreme Court of Canada came out with a judgment, and it was Calder versus the Queen, right? And that judgment basically recognized Aboriginal title in Canada. So when we met Trudeau on Valentine's Day, 1973, 2 weeks after that judgment came out, we said to him, "No longer nebulous, Mr. Trudeau." We have Aboriginal rights and title in Canada. So let's sit down like reasonable people and let's negotiate. And to his credit, he no longer said, it's a nebulous concept. To his credit, he said, "Yes, I will accept a proposal to negotiate comprehensive land claims in Canada." And that pronouncement by Trudeau on Valentine's Day, I think he loved us. Ironic that it was on Valentine's Day. But he accepted our proposal. So we've been in this process, as my chief advised, for 50 years. So what have we done in that 50 years? Well, I think we've done a lot. We managed to achieve a final agreement. It took us 20 years to negotiate a treaty. And I have to take my hat off to all of the people that are in this room who have sat at these tables for indeterminate, long periods of time. It's somewhat akin to waiting for an elevator at the Westin. It takes a long time, right? And so we managed to complete final agreements. We completed agreements on self-government. And we didn't only do land claims. I mean, I've got to respect the old-timers, and I think I'm one of those old-timers, in the sense that we weren't just doing land claims talks. We were doing constitutional talks at the same time. We were telling Canada, Indians, Métis, Inuit, we belong somewhere in the Constitution of Canada, right? We deserve a place in the Constitution of Canada. Not only deserve, but we insist that we belong in the supreme law of Canada. And so while we were doing the land claims talks, we came out to a number of constitutional conferences. Those were exciting times, right? Some of the chiefs went over to England to launch an appeal against the Crown for breaching their agreements, their treaties, a number of treaties, and not successfully, but nonetheless they did launch those appeals in the 1980s. And those were interesting times, but I must say that I have to give credit because they were multitasking. They were doing negotiations on land claims and self-government agreements, and they were also articulating and representing us in constitutional conferences and saying, we need a place in the Constitution of Canada. Hence, on April 17th, 1982, the Constitution of Canada came into existence with Section 35, the recognition and affirmation of Aboriginal people and their rights in the Constitution of Canada. So that was indeed part of their work and part of our work in that respect. And I don't think, in my opinion, we went through a series of failed constitutional conferences in the 1980s, at least 4 of them, in which we failed to convince the provinces and Canada that we have to define what's contained in Section 35 of the Constitution of Canada, the affirmation and recognition of our rights, titles, and interests. What does it fully mean? It can't simply mean that our final agreements, our treaties, are all that are contained in Section 35 of the Constitution Act. It can't simply just mean that. It's got to mean more. The original occupants, owners of this land, deserve more than simply a passing reference in Section 35. Let's define what Section 35 means. That work is not completed yet. I think Canada has a responsibility, an obligation to fulfill that. And simply because they promised in the Constitution Act 1982 to hold 3 constitutional conferences that all failed, it doesn't mean that their work is done, in my humble opinion. It means that we as a collective people, Métis, Inuit, First Nations, we have a duty and an obligation, I think, to all of our young people to make sure that these rights are crystallized, defined, and enshrined in the Constitution Act of Canada. That's the unfinished, untold story that has to be fulfilled yet. And we're not there yet. So our treaties, our agreements on self-government could not be a total fulfillment of what goes into Section 35. And if there is one sort of piece of advice that I would give, I think I could rely upon my elder status, is that please fulfill that. I spent the last 2 days with a great honor for me with the young people doing a treaty simulation. And, you know, the potential and the capacity and the desire by those young people really inspired and encouraged me to basically say, yeah, we attempted to fulfill a foundation to provide them with a better world. And I think to your credit, all of you out there, that we have done that. We have provided them a better world, for sure. In a constitutional context, in the context of final agreements, self-government agreements, implementation, we've totally done that. But we owe it to them, and they owe it to us, I think, to complete that circle, to ensure that there is a better world for not only us, but certainly for them and their children. And I just want to close by saying I wish you all well, a great conference, and thank you very much for listening to me during this period of time. I know that in the Yukon we've got 11 final agreements, 11 agreements on self-government, and those powers in the self-government agreements are not fulfilled yet. We've got exclusive lawmaking power. We've got paramount concurrent lawmaking power over our citizens, not only on settlement land, so-called, but throughout the Yukon Territory. So that if we were to pass, Champagne-Ajac First Nations, were to pass a child care law, that law is paramount concurrent to a conflicting law of the Yukon. And also we've got paramount concurrent laws over about 16,060 square miles of so-called settlement lands or treaty lands. The only concurrent lawmaking power that we share with Canada and Yukon is over taxation. And the paradox is that under Section 125 of the Constitution Act, 1867, provinces and the federal government cannot tax each other. Period, full stop. So if we are equals, in my humble view, our governments should be tax exempt as well. And I think as part of the next constitutional process, indeed, I know that taxation is currently in vogue in a national context, and that they're beginning to restore tax exemptions for those First Nations that had to surrender their tax exemptions. I think that topic of equating to equality with provinces and with the government of Canada is indeed not only in vogue, but also should be topical in the sense that we too are governments. We too should enjoy the same degree of equity, equality that they enjoy by being tax exempt. And I think that for those young people that I shared the last 2 days with, I throw the torch to you to carry on that message about equity and equality and creating a place for us in the Constitution of Canada. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to my former chief and John Bizot, my good friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you very much, Mr. Joe. One of the things that, I grew up with Dave, like my whole life I've known him, and our families are tied together because my grandmother and his dad were first cousins, so brother and sister, and his father was one of the really, really very kind-hearted mentors to my dad. So thank you again, Dave, for that. We'll have some questions. Make sure if you have rights. My question popped in right at the end, so we'll wait until. Could I actually ask during this next presentation if Patty Black could come up and just confirm with me one question that I have? So I now call upon Dr. John Bizot, and I apologize for not giving you the title that you are recognized by. He was the land claims negotiator for the former Treaty 11 Council, now that concluded in 1994, the establishment of the Clichy government in 2005. John is now senior advisor to the Clichy government and chairperson of Hoti Sita. So welcome, Dr. John Bizot.
Well, thank you very much. I think when I was growing up, I never expected to kind of be up here, and I think I'm expecting my first pension check this month. I want to thank the Kingston government executive, the Grand Chief, and the Assembly members for allowing me to be here, because it takes a long time to be anywhere. But it really started with back in the early 1980s when one of my issues at the time as a young person, just full of vinegar, and the canoes that have been going on since time immemorial back to the Barren Lands had all of a sudden stopped back around the early 70s. And I thought it would be my turn to go, and all of a sudden it stopped. And it continued, and so that's why I got into the politics and most of the community politics. And when I went in there to kind of become aware of all the decision makers, it was mostly elders that were there. And so I couldn't really speak, and they had all the knowledge. So all I could do was just listen. And over that listening, we were able to organize with not only the elders at the beginning, but I got introduced to another young man who was probably about 31 at the time, and his name was Joe Rabiska. And he could really talk. I mean, he was a young guy, but he could really talk. And so I kind of latched onto him, and I hung around with him until he became a Grand Chief at the age of 34. And he liked to go out on canoes, so then we started going out on the, that was actually way back in '83. And so the first, we started going to meetings and eventually organized with elders, again, the elder advisors at a Friendship Center movement about going back to the land. And so they said, okay, we'll be right behind you, but we'll fly. You guys go by boat. And so we organized this back to the land after 16 years of break, after 10,000 years of doing it, okay? And it was huge. And the elders were there, and all the young people and the middle-aged and some in their 60s had come with us, and we went all the way to the Barren Lands and took us over 10 days. And when we got there, there was a huge amount of people standing on the landscape, you know, welcoming us. And it was very, very emotional. But what it did was it started this movement of going back to the land. And the more we went back to the land, since '88, we've never stopped. And, you know, that's why I want to thank the leadership for keeping it going. And we're now in the 40th year, because that's the basis for knowing what you're fighting for, knowing that the knowledge of the land is what's going to carry us forward, because the land is where your language comes from. It's where you express your cultural values based on the landscape. And it's our way of life. And so that's the basis of going to the land, and we've been going there ever since. And the more I went into the land, the more I started to understand that it was pocketed full of place names. And over time, I started to realize that some of the oldest place names had to do with large animals. And they would point out to them to say that we don't go close to it, we can look at it from a distance, because we have to honor them. And then there were more place names about how animals and people. There were place names of animals who would go fishing, who would go hunting. And there would be places of ceremony, of growth, where you can bring your youth who are troubled. And then an inventory of where all the animals were, an inventory of where you can fish, the method of harvesting, and the navigational place names that had to do it. And traveling the landscape, the elders will talk about legends that are attached to these places. So our whole history is literally written into the landscape. And when I got introduced into becoming a negotiator way back in 1988, and they asked me to be a negotiator, and I said, no, I can't do it. I don't know anything about a land claim. And so they said, well, of course you don't. Nobody does. But we'll teach you everything about the land, about but you got to keep going to the landscape, because that's where the answers are. That's what you're trying to protect. The legal stuff, the lawyers can handle it, you know, but it's our expression, our voices that make their way into the agreement, and not only protecting what we've always had, but what we have now, and what recognition that we're trying to work into the systems that we're becoming very accustomed to. And ever since then, we've been going to the landscape, and for the last 40 years, the minimum amount of people that have gone every summer has always been about 30, okay? And the highest that number that we've taken people on the landscape has been 160. So if you take an average between those in the last 40 years, that's the amount of youth and elders that we had taken onto the land. And so our collective knowledge is really about the landscape, and that's what we carry. And the agreement is to protect what we have. And that's important because what we have, and today even the Land Claim Agreement Coalition, that you're now fostering a youth simulation where it's very similar to a canoe trip of Land Claim Agreement Coalition history of at least 20 years of knowledge that we've gained together. And that knowledge is about our shared history, which is really on the indigenous side, our relationship to our land, language, culture, and way of life. But after we got our 1992, I was at the tail end of the denominated claim. And part of the failure, a big part of that failure of the denominated claim was that the agreement didn't quite reflect the comfort of the people that were there to approve it on the indigenous values. And so I think that's what the big thing was. And so when we got into our Clinton Agreement and the ability to negotiate in 1992, the first place that we went to was, when we hired Pape and Salter, we just didn't go and hire them. We interviewed them, whether they had the abilities. And one of the first things that they've done when we started moving was we went to the Yukon. And one of the places I remember going to was at Dave Joe's office. Went into his office, and he's sitting there behind the table, and when I looked into the back of his desk, he had a shelving with notebooks, going back a couple of shelves, and I thought, well, this guy keeps a lot of notes. And so that's when I was determined, that was my first training, was I'm going to keep notes. And so my notebook collection is, boxes and boxes and boxes. I don't look back on it, but it's a way of documenting a journey that is about building a nation. Not building a nation in terms of what we've always had. We've always had a nation, but the building of a nation is that our expression to the outside world, building that connection to the outside world without ever having to lose ourselves. And if we gain things on the Western side, it's about ensuring that we keep up our engagement up to the times, so that that we're never ever caught off guard to where we have to kind of say there was some loss. Okay, and one of the things about being on the road and working with people were the team that we had, which was Eddie Rasmus, who was the lands negotiator who just recently passed away, a former Grand Chief, and Ted Blondin, who was the manager of the claim, because he really was the manager. He just kept us in line and making the connections in Ottawa because he had that charisma and he knew people. And we had James Washi, who was the former president of the Indian Brotherhood of Northwest Territories and a former minister within the government of Northwest Territories, and myself. So we had a team that, totally spoke our language and who had experiences in the building of the structures towards negotiations and experience in the modern day agreements that were going on. But the key thing was having elder advisors. And the elder advisors that we had at the time was Alexis Aramaker, and we had Joe Migwi, and we had John Natsiza, and we had Harry Simpson. And eventually we got Jimmy Rabiska to replace Johnny after his passing. So the key thing is that, we have negotiators, and we always had elder advisors. And the elder advisors are the one who worked the community, that worked with the other elders to give a form of comfort that we are on the right path, that we are on that right trail where it's about building the nation. And that building the nation not only stops there, it also starts with working with our young people. And, I've been part of the youth simulation for the last 5 years since it started. And each year, you can see a difference. Each year, you can see some strength. Each year, you can see some hope. And each year, and especially this session here, that I have much more confidence, that these things that all the people have worked for all these years are going to be in good hands. But we need to ensure that we keep it going, because that's the toughest part, is keeping these things going and fostering it and feeding it, and become advisors if you can. Put yourself forward. Like, everybody has a time limit, and things change in modern day agreements where you have constant new leadership and constant new ways of doing things. And what we have is our experience of the early years. And things are getting more technical. You're dealing with handhelds, you're dealing with computers, and just logging in on Facebook for my generation is a huge task, And so things are changing. The information is very, very fast. And that's why you always need to have young people involved. And one of the things is that I'd like to thank everyone for allowing me to be up here to share my story and my background, and I wish you well, and that we go back to our communities stronger than ever. Masicho.
Shoni Thun, Dr. Zoe. We have, Mr. Atami is not going to join us, so we do have a few more minutes actually during this session to open up for some questions if anybody have any questions. If you do, just stand up and walk to one of the mics. There's mics located, like I said, on either side of the room. I am checking my text feed, I guess. And there are no questions yet from the online virtual world. And if there are none, I will ask a question of both Mr. Joe and Dr. Zoe about, I'll open up the questions. What would you do differently if you were to start it knowing, having all the knowledge today and starting again where you started back 40 and 50 years ago?
Is this on? Yep. Well, the first thing I would do is when your father asked me to work as part of the land claims agreement process for a lofty $600 a month. I was making twice that, working in construction and in the mines in the Yukon. And when he said, "Young man, I need your help," I would have said, "No, Chief, I'm not." But I'm thankful that I did. And I think what I would do differently is probably, as John B. said, right? I became a chief negotiator when I was 27 years old. And that takes a lot of time, a lot of commitment, and you're always on the road. And what I would do differently is pay more attention to my people, my family, my children, and now my grandchildren. I got a daughter in the room, Jessie. Just raise your hand. Yeah. She is expecting with twins, so isn't that great? And so now, as I'm getting older, I really appreciate that. As John B. said, is just spending time with the people that you love and with the work that you've got to do to create this constitutional foundation for us all. So that's certainly what I would do differently. And be less Captain Sin and more.
I think I'm on.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I would do differently, I'm not sure because I haven't really thought about it. But, some things is that, finish school. That's what I probably would have done differently. But at the time, the systems were very, very different than they are today, that we're just a product of residential schools. And when it came to the public schools, if your mind frame is from a residential schools, it's very hard to fit into the public system. And so that transitional period, I think a lot of people even here would know that that's where the failure was. So it really had nothing to do with choice. And so the thing that I would do differently is, to encourage young people to finish, because at the time, our generation, all our parents spoke only the language. They had no idea about the schools. They don't know how to inform or what's going on. All they know is that you come back and re-immerse you back into the language, re-immerse you back into hunting and gathering, and re-immersing you back, to what it was, like a very mixed way of living, and you have to kind of figure it out. But for what I would do differently, like I say, is immerse yourself into the community, because we all have been part of our communities for the last 10,000 years. The people, our communities, our nations, we've been together for over 10,000 years. We're a family. We're a collection of families here. And if we step away from them, it's to gain knowledge and to help the people to get more recognition for the rights that have been denied for a very long time. And it's honorable work. It's satisfying work. And we're doing things, we have the ability, not the smarts, but the ability that those elders who stepped forward way back in the 60s and even in the 70s to create an atmosphere to where we are sitting here today. It's built upon those mixture of people that didn't have the abilities, but they had the will that something could be better in how we are recognized internally and externally. Masi.
Well, thank you for that response, but I take issue with your remark of saying you not having the smarts. In my experience, anybody who has doctor in front of their name usually comes with a fair amount of yeehaw, right? I turn to Mike on the left-hand side for a question. Can you please state your name and title and then your question? Thank you.
I'm a Heathlook. My name is Elaine Moore. I'm the chief counselor, slow down, think, of the Nishkat village of Gitwinsilk. I'm very humbled and honored to hear the presentation this morning. I'm excited to hear that you're still got your wits about you and are able to hold our attention with your humor. One of the things that we discovered within the last little bit is, that hit home when you talked about making more money in the industry than you did with the governance work that you've done. And we don't compensate our people that have been in this field for a lifetime. So when they're done their time through the work of getting to the modern day treaty, they're done their job. They've spent their lifetime getting our modern day treaty. They leave the politics and they're worse off with no income. They don't have the same benefits that the province or the feds have as politicians. You get a cushy life when you leave that arena. But as First Nations people, we don't. I can attest to you, I made more money in bookkeeping and what have you before I got into this role. And I'm like, people think we're making a lot of money. I'm like, what the heck? I get beat up by my whole community now when I just had a job and I was living. So I take my hat off And I think we need to start thinking differently about what we're paying our people to do this work. And think about what the provinces gets when they leave this job. They get a handshake. You just get pushed out the door and the door hits you on your way out, you know? We don't show enough appreciation. So I want to say thank you very much for the work that you've done, and especially to my colleagues that are here. We're fighting really hard to get something that they can rely on comfortably when they leave here. A lot of our colleagues right now, you know, it's hard to see them after they've spent their lifetime away from their families. We don't acknowledge that enough, so I appreciate your voice in that manner. Kabiklet.
Any responses?
You know, that comment about the fact that most of you in this room do not have a pension. Most of you in this room who have worked for your people a number of years don't have a pension, aside from maybe old age and CPP, which is probably less than $1,000 a month. And by comparison, this is part of the equity or the equality. If you are an employee of a province, an employee of the federal government, you get a good pension. You are guaranteed that for all the commitment that you've showed to a province, a territory, or to Canada. At the end of the day, all you get is maybe a golden handshake and an exit out the door. I think as a people, we have to design a national integrated pension plan for our citizens who have dedicated their lives so that when they exit the scene, which we all will, that there's not only a thank you, but there's also a pension plan that is put in place. And one of my objectives as part of this is to ensure that happens. And certainly I think we deserve it, Canada deserves it, and more importantly, you deserve it.
Thank you very much. I go to Mike on the left again for your question.
Okay, Emma Heath, look, it's quite a privilege to be in the room today and listening to you two gentlemen talk about some wonderful pieces of history that some of us got to live through and transition through and had the freedom to be able to start to amass a pension when we were quite young because of the follies of our federal government and what they imposed upon our people. And grandmothers like mine who insisted that we start looking at that stuff so we didn't have to live such a hard life like other people. And by the time we got to a time of retirement, we wouldn't be struggling. And I think we become far more progressive as young modern treaty people. We have treaty folks in our territory that have never grown up knowing the Indian Act, have never grown up knowing other things. So they are far more progressive in regards to their thoughts on pensions and opportunities. But you've touched on a few things that really kind of got me. And I see that as the real dilemma, Doctor, is that I think that when you talk about the balance and equity that was supposed to be brought forth with modern land claims agreements and looking at the equity between the cultural piece and the more modern piece, it's always in the eyes of the colonizer that they give you a bit of a gift to say we're going to self-govern from this perspective or self-govern from this perspective. And what I see is the imbalance in that perspective, right? And I think we have those capabilities within many of our modern treaties to have far more of a reflective balance from a lands participatory piece for our people, because because demographically right now we're in a real predicament. And if we don't address the demographics, like you want to hand a torch off, you're going to hand a torch off to a bunch of kids in downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver or Ottawa for the many Inuit. And then you're going to say, okay, you managed their self-governing agreement from there. And then the feds are sitting there smiling away. There's a big challenge we have here, and I think we need to really sit down as a collective of the LCAC and really start to figure out how do we really get our people back to the lands, and how do we really start to actually include our people on the land, not just in government, but how do we reintroduce traditional processes or getting out onto the land in a far more conducive manner. I hear you talking about it a lot, so I really wanted to just say that that's a real dilemma for so many of our people.
Any response? No response?
Well, I can talk a little bit about a traditional form of pension. As a young person, our community was relocated, but eventually nobody moved, but a number of people did. And it was, my family was one of the people that moved to the new town. But there's nothing there. There's no place to tie up your dog team, so if we eventually lost our dog team. There's no place to park a boat, so we eventually lost our boat. And but nobody moved. The rest of the people stayed right where they're going to be. And so all the houses that were built into the new community were now taken up by government workers. And so the people just stayed where there was no running water. Because you're talking about 1970, where people needed access to the lakes and to the land to do their harvesting because nobody was working. You know, what's the purpose of having running water when you have nothing to eat, really, and no jobs? But one thing I noticed that is I become pulled back to the community, and really there's no place to stay when you go there, but my grandmother had stayed there, so I spent a lot of time staying at her place. And every day I would sit down downstairs and next to her bed, and I can see people coming in every day, and they would offer her dry fish, dry meat, fresh fish, and that was her pension. And when you were hungry, and she'll pull out this little box from under her bed, and that's how she fed the young people. And so it was always there. We just have to convert it to a new, modern way so that those traditional systems is upgraded to what we're accustomed to today. Masi.
Thank you. So, that is a real dilemma for our people. We have two people on the floor, and we have one, I'm going to say the person online, I'll give their question. Just like to remind, we're in the last 10 minutes. No, we want to have a break, so if you can get to your question as quickly as possible, and then the responses as succinct as possible as well. So this is from Tanya McIntosh. When including our future leaders, the youth, in these events, how do you prepare them before they show up to that event? Reading material, pre-conference meetings, how do you do that?
I think it works both ways, is that there has to be some motivation to find out what you're entering into. We've been led to believe that another way of life is what we should be accustomed to. And so there's always a mixed feeling that if it comes from the indigenous side, the tendency is to put barriers in front of yourself to try to get to that type of information. So I think self-motivation, interest, and wanting to know more is the is the entry level. It's the curiosity of just getting into the unknown is the first step. Masi.
Thank you. So we will go to the floor. Mike on the left, and then we'll finish with Mr. McKay.
Amahiluk. My name is Ntluduk Samkak. My English name is Sherry Small. I come originally from the village of Lakhalzap of the Niska Nation. I represent the membership of our nation that reside in Vancouver, Metro Vancouver area, which is referred to under our treaty as the urban local. With my life experience, my observation with direct experience, there's a lot of negative connotation that goes with urban Indian, urban Niska. It's just as derogatory as non-status Indians. And I want to thank you too. I've observed you in the last few days. I watched how you engaged with the youth, how you listened intently, how you shared respect with them, with their knowledge. I followed suit and did the same with the representatives from my nation. What I have observed and listened in the last few days, this is a real issue in all of our nations, that we're following suit under the Indian Act of these derogatory terminologies that have a huge impact on our spirit. And thank you too for representing us and sharing and reminding me of my ancestors who sat with you, Dr. Frank Calder, who happens to be my uncle, that I I come from a long line of leadership. And they would always caution me, you're a Niska, no matter where you live. When you go out and get your education, don't forget who you are and where you come from. The principles and values that you're instilled with as you grow up on the land remain within you, and therefore you become the best you can be. So I want to say thank you for acknowledging of you're working, and you're working with daycare. That's the area I work in, work with the city of Vancouver and the province. And I pound the table about the reality is the fact that we have thousands of Indigenous people from all your territories in Vancouver. And I do not represent Niska in Vancouver. I represent Indigenous people who have been forgotten in the laws and policies of the white man. They push me away and try to say we're distinctions-based, we're First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I have offered the federal government last couple of days before I came here, can you please include as well the Indigenous peoples of Canada also means those that are living outside their ancestral territories. And help me know if I'm on the right track of doing that, fighting for our people outside our ancestral territories. Majority of the time, it's not by choice, as you have identified, lack of housing, lack of opportunity. We went out and got our education as you guys have requested us to, but there's no space. So I really seek your guidance in this area. How do we become inclusive, equitable, to celebrate that diversity? Thank you.
Response?
I would say that you've provided like your own insight and the answers to your question. As Indigenous people, we carry our fundamental values wherever we go. And that if we were to reside, and I have, of course, I've been known as an urban Indian. I've resided in Vancouver, for example, 20 years, working for other First Nations in the province of BC, trying to instill in the province of BC, and it is a struggle because of the colonial constructs that exist, to convince them to adopt values that are fair, that are equal, that are just for all people. And I think as long as internally we all realize who we are, where we come from, what we represent, I think will make Canada, generally speaking, and your nation a lot stronger. And I think that the answers that you provided as part of your question, your speech, are internal to that. And there's no distinction whether you live at Cluckshoe or in downtown Vancouver. I know that I am always a member of my First Nation, and the values that were instilled in me by my parents and my grandparents, and that I will carry that. And as long as we do it with pride and distinction, then we should accept that collectively as a people. So thank you for that question and those comments.
Thank you. Turn to Mr. McKay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jim Gigat. Sige naman na. Scobo Wilson. Concha Nix. Scobo Kate. Hereditary chiefs. Patriarchs. Respected elders. Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, and most importantly, the youth who are our future leaders. My name is Kevin McKay, and I come from the Nishka village of Lachazap. I am proud to stand with my colleagues from the Lachazap village government amongst all of you. For your information, at this stage of my life, I also hold a dual responsibility for our nation as Speaker of Wilpsayuk Niskat, which is our parliament, our government. I would like to first of all thank the presenters for opening their hearts with all of us today. Indeed, in doing so, the both of you help us to understand a deeper meaning behind the theme of this year's conference, honoring our past, building upon our future. I've known about you, both of you, for many, many years because of your decades of public service in pursuit of the land question. I've known both of you personally during my affiliation over the last 20 years with the Land Claims Agreement Coalition. So I truly respect your opinions, indeed, your expertise and your experience. The premise of the Nisga'a land question, one purpose: get rid of the Indian Act. Period. Full stop. In 2024, the Nisga'a Nation will celebrate our 24th year of leaving behind the Indian Act. Yet I don't have to go very far in all 7 of our Nisga'a communities, and I can still see the remnants of the Indian Act. Don't get me wrong. I'm not speaking against the treaty. Far from it. Like all of you, our beacon of hope in the Nisga'a Nation is our youth, our children. As my colleague, Mr. Robinson, said a while back when he had the mic on the floor, for the Nisga'a Nation, there is an entire generation of Nisga'a citizens who will be 23 years old this year, and they have not had to live one day of their lives under the Indian Act. I think that is remarkable. And it's worth noting because it has to be our beacon of hope. Our elders tempered our expectations with the advent of the Nisga'a Treaty. They told us, it's not like you can walk over to that wall and flick a switch and the Indian Act and everything that it represents will be gone forever. They cautioned us it would take time, and that is true to their infinite wisdom. To both of you, what suggestions, recommendations do you have for the coalition in being more effective in our representation of the 26 modern treaties in Canada so far? What would be your recommendation to be more effective in truly getting rid of the Indian Act in our daily lives and in our communities? Because until we reach that great time, sometime in the future, it will be forever holding us back. And I don't say that in a negative way. It's just a statement of fact. But I would, Mr. Chair, through you, be very interested to hear both of your esteemed presenters' perspective on my question. Thank you for listening to me.
Oh, geez. Doc.
I think that in my humble opinion, that how we get rid of the ability of another government to pass laws over our lives, over our people, is wrong. The constitutional construct of Canada, as we know it, in which Canada has the exclusive rights over Indians, over Métis, over Inuit, under Section 9124 of the Constitution Act 1867, is wrong. And all of the resulting statutes that emanate from that constitutional power is wrong. So I would suggest to all of you and to LCAC that there has to be a rethink, a remake of the constitutional construct of Canada, whereby we become not only partners, but equal partners in Canada. And my proposal is that LCAC and all of you work to renewing the foundational constructs in a constitutional context for Canada, just to make sure that our place is there and that there would be no Indian Act or no government that would have jurisdiction over you but yourselves. That is my suggestion. Thank you.
I think at at the beginning we were a whole people, whole person, whole individuals. And back in 1876, we were shrouded by the Indian Act. We were hidden. And now we're coming out and trying to be who we were before in recognition, because we've always been who we are. But in recognition, it's about emerging from that. And the LCAC, what we're doing together, sharing as much information as possible. We can do more, but this is where we are at. And so for the Indian Act, what we have now that we've emerged to, expose ourselves to fighting the Indian Act, that we're right down to just a scratch, a little scab. And the thing is legally what it is that's eventually going to get rid of that scab, that so that we emerge as we were before. And our new engagement would be in terms of what our elder in our community, Elizabeth McKenzie, said, that we should be strong like two people without having to give up who we are. We have identity, but we also have the skills of the Western world to ensure that that shroud never, ever comes back. Masi.
Well, thank you all. Of course, our two esteemed speakers, Dr. Zhou and of course, Mr. Zhou, both bring a wealth of experience. I think this plenary could probably go a whole morning. Hear the powerful statements from the people at the mics, providing statements and questions. Very, very good. I think that from an observer and somebody who's actually been in the trenches, the only statement I can say is we're actually doing what our old ones wanted us to do. That we just have to be both patient and cognizant of the fact that, you know, if we're building a hockey team, we're still just building the hockey team, understanding the game, and very, very soon, we're gonna have the champions show up, those young ones who are coming, the prodigies that are right behind us. And so, although we may not be able to see the true fruition of the efforts, the path that we're going along is quite reassuring, both to myself and I think the rest of the people that we represent.